Inner Light, the space where heart meets truth. Today, we are joined by Christian Della Huerta, a soulful force in the world of personal and spiritual transformation. With over 3 decades of experience guiding others through breathwork, empowerment, and authentic love, Christian is here to illuminate what it means to live and love consciously. His latest book, Conscious Love, invites us to rethink everything we believe about relationships, power, and purpose. Let's dive into the deeper dimensions of connection. Welcome to the show, Christian. It's an honor to have you.
Hi, Anya. Thanks so much for having me.
Mhm. So, Christian, you have helped so many people rediscover the essence of love. But let's start at the root. What is conscious love to you?
Conscious love is a kind of love that is intentional. It is courageous, it's liberating, and it's rooted in personal responsibility and accountability. So, as opposed to confusing love with possessiveness or validation or escaping or seeking to validate ourselves by being with somebody else. Also, it's different from infatuation. It's the kind of love that invites us to really connect with ourselves, with one another, and with life itself.
Mm-hmm. Right. And how does it differ from the romanticized love we often chase or settle for?
Yeah, I think the word itself captures is that we romanticize it, we idealize it. And all of popular culture supports that, with songs like I Can't Live Without You and You Complete Me. And, you know, it's an idealized version of love that does not exist. Um, and part of what this connects to too is that we confuse the feeling of love, the emotion of love, with the actual act and work of loving. And these are teachings taken from Scott Peck, or elaborating on Scott Peck, who wrote a book called The Road Less Traveled. So he writes about how because we can't always go by the feeling, right? Because love, we have this expectation that love is going to feel good, and it's all about roses and chocolates and uh, dates and stuff like that. Um, but think about disciplining a child. Say imagine a child is running off onto a busy street, and you have to like grab the child by the hand and pull it back and say no, like with energy, sometimes even with anger energy. That doesn't feel good, but it's an act of love. It's an act of love for the protection of the child. So in the same way, in romantic intimate relationships, sometimes we have to do things for the sake of the other person, for the sake of the relationship, that don't feel good, but they are an act of loving. And Scott Peck defines love as when we place ourselves outside of the comfort zone for the sake of the spiritual growth of another human being. Right. So we've got to abandon whenever we take ourselves outside of our little comfort zone, the place where we're comfortable being in the world, being with others, um, for the sake of somebody else. And he specifies even more, for the sake of the spiritual growth of somebody else. That's love. And love is an act, not a feeling.
That's such a liberating lens. Love as expansion, not dependency.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. What we call possessive dependency, that's not love. That's something else.
Mm-hmm. 100%. And you talk about transforming a relationship to relationships. What do you see as the top challenge people face when seeking deep connection today?
Well, in the book, I get into probably 10 different challenges, uh, that, patterns that get in the way of having the kind of relationships that we want to have. And the first one is that, right? It's exactly how we approach the relationship. So if we approach that relationship like we were talking about a minute ago, with unrealistic expectations, like you are going to complete me, you're going to make me happy, forget it. Like it's not the job of anybody else to make us happy. And it's putting a lot of responsibility on that other person and on the relationship to complete us to make us happy. So that's not going to work. Another way in which we tend to challenge ourselves, is we were alluding to it right now, is that we confuse infatuation for love. So we confuse that high, that incredible feeling, that initial phase where we're in love, what we call in love, quotes, in quotes, with the work of actual loving. Um, and so he talks about how the honeymoon period, which is that phase where the other person can do no wrong. We see them through rose-colored glasses. What's happening during that honeymoon, and this is my interpretation, is that the ego boundaries, that keep us separate during that honeymoon phase, they dissipate. So we feel one with that person. We feel like they can do no wrong until 3 months later, 6 months later, maybe 9 months if you haven't moved in together. At some point, when they put the toilet paper in the wrong way, or and everybody knows that the right way is facing down, or they squeeze the toothpaper from the wrong end. At that moment, the ego boundaries come back up, and now the honeymoon's over, and then the person can do nothing right, and then we go looking for the right one. We go in search of a greener pasture. And Scott Peck Scott Peck talks about how it's when the honeymoon ends that the work of real loving begins. And now it's time to get real. Now we can really get into what this relationship is about. The first honeymoon phase, the first few months were, I think it's a biological trick of nature to ensure the survival of the species. And then one of the other ways in which, we have challenges in relationships is that we're constantly dragging our past into the present. So we carry our wounds, our unhealed past, into our current relationships. So, for example, if somebody cheated on us in the past, or I've worked with couples who, and this is almost subconscious, they made the choice when they were really young, when they were kids. They saw their parents fighting. Their parents ended up getting divorced, and they made a choice. And they said to themselves, "I'm never going to do that." But then, they never healed that wound. They never understood it from the perspective of an adult. And so what happens, because then on the other hand, we still have that longing, that desire to be with somebody in that intimate, beautiful kind of relationship, that is like in conflict with the "I'm never going to do that." So what happens is we start attracting people who are not a match. And this happens subconsciously. So we sabotage our relationships even before we get started with them, by falling for people who are not available. They're already with somebody else. They live in another country, or people who are just not there emotionally, or people who are just not a match. And it's not a good strategy, because we end up creating the very same thing that we're trying to avoid, is that our relationships are not going to work. And so we end up alone.
Definitely. And do you think our fast paced, digitally driven lives are rewiring how we approach intimacy?
Yes, definitely. Um, that is one of the challenges of relationships, is that we don't take the time to nurture them, and relationships require nurturing. So, I talk about how in a relationship there's three entities. There's you, there's me, and then there's the relationship, which is like a third part of this of the relationship. It's an entity that also requires nourishing and care. And if we don't take care of it, it's not going to survive. It's just like a garden that we need to water it and take care of it, and make sure the light is not too strong, make sure that it's getting some light. And like you're saying, because we live in such overscheduled, busy lives, we just don't have the time, or we just don't take the time. We prioritize other aspects of our life, and our relationships end up paying the price for that.
Yes, and in that rush, we often lose the presence that real love requires.
Yes, absolutely. Um, Love requires presence in both parts, right? Otherwise, it becomes a projection. It's not real. And presence is a necessary part of happiness. If we want to have relationships that have a chance of working, if we want to have a life that is successful, that is filled of meaning with purpose, it all begins with presence, and it all begins with self-awareness. We have to ask ourselves questions like, how did I get into this type of relationship again? Because if we get really honest, we recreate our relationships. We sometimes it feels like it's the same boring movie, only with a different actor, with a different co-lead. And at some point, it's like the same kind of arguments coming up, the same kind of conflict, only with a different person. So at some point, we have to get honest and realize that there is one common denominator in every one of those arguments and in every one of those relationships, and it's right here. And then look within. Why do I do that? Why do I get triggered by certain behaviors? What about this pattern? Let me start looking at my life. Why do I keep attracting a certain kind of person? Or why do I keep getting stuck in a certain type of power struggle? Is it with authority figures? Is it with parental figures? Is it where issues where agency and independence are at stake, or is money involved? Right. So begin to pay attention, and that only comes with self-awareness. And self-awareness is only possible by being present, by noticing what's happening in us and around us.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And you have long championed the breath as a path to healing and empowerment. How does conscious breathing play into relationship healing?
Well, and that's a big conversation, Anya. As you know, breath work is a big, broad umbrella term, and it serves relationships at many levels. So, for example, at a simpler level, we start getting into an argument and we can see where it's heading, right? We can feel the signs already that it's headed towards an argument. Like our palms start getting sweat. We start breathing more shortly. Sometimes we even stop breathing. Our breathing becomes labored. We don't even notice. Our hands get flushed. Our, our heart starts palpitating. Our hearts start palpitating faster. That's the moment of choice. And the best way to interrupt that before we go over the waterfall is to take a breath, to take several deep breaths. There's swamis that have that much control over their body that they can tell their heart to slow down, and their heart slow down. Most of us are never going to have that kind of awareness and control over our bodies, but anybody who has the presence can choose to slow down the breath. Anybody. It's not a hard thing to do. We just need to be present and remember to do it. And so when the breath slows down, the heart has no choice. The heart has to slow down. When the heart slows down, the body begins to relax. The nervous system begins to quiet down. And then we can make a choice about how we show up in that conversation, in that relationship, in order to avoid getting into that same old boring argument that we've had dozens of times, maybe hundreds of times. And like you're saying, it begins with presence, and the breath is the best instrument that I know to keep us from going over the waterfall and then going into that cycle of reaction and regret. React, regret. We do something, and then the adrenaline dissipates, and 5 minutes, 10 minutes later, we're like, oh my god, why did I say that? That was so mean. I wish I had said it in a different way. And so that's one way. Breath work, the longer, more intense the breath work that I facilitate, which you breathe in a certain way, in a circular, connected way, for about an hour, sometimes a little bit longer. It's the most effective way that I know to heal past trauma and to bring emotional healing. So, what we were talking about earlier are part of the problem. One of the reasons we get into relationship problems and challenges is that we carry all our wounds from the past, all that unhealed stuff. And I've been doing breath work for 35 years. My dad was a psychiatrist, my degree's in psychology. And when I discovered breath work 35 years ago, I jumped tracks. I never went for the PhD because it works so fast and heals so profoundly at so many levels, and in particular in that emotional mental arena, so that we can heal our past traumas, so that we learn how to forgive ourselves and takes us to a place of being able to forgive others. And we can bring choice back into the equation rather than reacting in the present moment to something that was something that happened years ago, in some cases decades ago, that was never dealt with. And so, but it's still impacting our relationships from the unconscious. Like we try to sweep that stuff under the rug because we don't want to think about it, we don't want to feel it. It doesn't feel good, but it doesn't work that way. Right? That's sweeping it under the rug doesn't work. Like we've been taught now by physics that everything is energy. Even what feels solid, like this chair that I'm sitting on, or the computer that I'm sitting in front of, even though it feels solid, even the body feels solid, but it's all vibration. We know from physics too that energy cannot be destroyed. And the emotions are energy, emotions, energy, emotion. And so every time, for all those times that we have swallowed those feelings, or that we have said yes when inside it was really a no. We really didn't want to do that or agree to that, but to avoid conflict, to not rock the boat too much, we settle for that illusion of peace, which never works because that stuff only goes underground and then it turns into resentment. So not a good strategy.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And can you walk us through a simple breathwork practice that helps reconnect with self and others?
Not that kind of deep breath work because I mean this space and the setting has to be, to me, it's very important, how you do it and where you do it and who you do it with. So I certainly don't feel safe doing that online, not knowing who might be on the other side and breathing and what kind of setting they're in. It's intense. It's powerful. Sometimes people have cathartic moments. You know, I can't tell you how many times I've seen people crying or screaming. Like in person, I know how to handle that. I've had people recover memories of sexual abuse that they had forgotten about. Like in person, I can handle that. I know I've handled it many, many times. But virtually, I've don't do it virtually for that reason. That there's nothing, there's I'm very limited in the ways that I can support and
Mhm.
intervene when we're doing it through a computer.
Right, that's okay. That makes sense. And
Yeah.
but that's such a powerful reminder that the breath doesn't lie, it brings us home.
Exactly. Yeah. The breath is our most loyal companion on this journey of being alive, on this journey of embodiment. And if we think about it, I mean, it's like we take the first breath and we take our last breath. Um, and if we think about it on top of that, in just about every religion and spiritual tradition all over the world, the same word, one word can mean breath or spirit. So there's something to that. There's something to that connection. And if we take it to another level still, we think of the element of argon, which is immutable. So which means that it doesn't change. So when we breathe in oxygen, we all know it comes out as carbon dioxide. When we breathe in argon, it comes out as the exact same boring argon that's been around for eons, which means that the argon that we're breathing right now is the exact argon that went through the lungs of the saber-toothed tiger and the woolly mammoth. The same argon that was breathed by the ancient Hindu sadhus and the the Jewish prophets and uh, all of the masters and the most creative minds throughout history. It's the same argon. So that we're actually, we think of ourselves so individually and so separately, but thinking about it this way helps us think of how we're all interconnected. We're all breathing the same recycled argon, even though we might be in different parts of the world right now. It's the same recycled argon that's going through all of our lungs. And another layer of that is that our DNA. We think of humans having four races. Our DNA, no matter how much skin pigmentation we have, we share 99.999% of our DNA is identical. So that's not enough difference to be considered a different race. It is one human race, technically, literally. In fact, we share 98.4 of our DNA with chimps, with chimpanzees. And 50% of our DNA is identical to bananas. So that we can really talk about not only one human family, but about the interconnectedness of all life. And that begins to bridge that sense of isolation and aloneness that many of us feel.
That's amazing.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it is amazing when you think about it that way.
Mhm. And how do we shift from power struggles to power sharing in our closest bonds?
Yeah, and that's another big conversation. We've all been stuck in power struggles. And one of the main things that we don't have time to get into today is understanding the ego mind. Um, but here's what one way to visualize it quickly that can help us understand it. If you put a baseball or a football in the center of a stadium, that's the ego, and the ego is the sense of self, the sense of separate personality. This is Christian, that's Anya. Um, so that sense that ego is that little football. Who we are is actually the stadium. And we've allowed ourselves to be hijacked by this tiny, tiny part of who we are and to make really important, consequential choices from its small, limited, and always fear based perspective. So really important to understand what the ego is. And in my previous book, Awakening the Soul of Power, I spent probably the first quarter of the book explaining what the ego is. Then the next step, which I get into that book, is understanding power, because there's a lot of confusion about power. We've been it's been conditioned in us that power is a bad thing. With quotes like "power corrupts," and "absolute power corrupts absolutely." And what good human being wants to be corrupted? Few of us do. Um, and then we've been taught that power is zero sum, so that your having power takes away from mine. So then we become really possessive and really defensive about our perception of power. And that's where we get stuck into power struggles. Whereas what's important to realize is that there's different types of power. So if we're talking about worldly power, or what I call ego power, the way that the world relates to power, political power, that's a great example of worldly power. Yeah, it's zero sum, and or it doesn't have to be, but it's generally viewed as that. And that's where we get into interpersonal struggles and international struggles. Whereas there's another type of power that I call soulful power, which to me Gandhi personifies. So if we think of which is humble and doesn't need to prove anything to anybody, it just is. So think about a Gandhi or a Gandalf, if you're a Lord of the Rings fan, in their simple monastic robes, their sandal feet. From looking at them, you would never know how much power they hold until it's necessary, and then get out of the way. And it's that type of power that I'm hoping that is not hierarchical, that it doesn't need for us to push anybody down, step on them, to be top dog, to win, in quotes. It's more the power that is power with, rather than power over. And we can work through all this stuff. We can work through all of our differences without needing to get stuck in power struggles where there's a quote unquote winner and there's inevitably a loser.
Yes, and conscious relationships require us to lead from wholeness, not wounds.
Exactly. Exactly. That's it, right? And that's the importance of of doing our work, kind of doing our work before we get into a relationship. Right? So, you know, we are talking about earlier, if we're approaching the relationship, it's okay, that's going to make me happy. That's going to fulfill me. That's going to give me meaning, give meaning to my life. Forget it. Hang it up. It's not fair to put that responsibility of another human or on the relationship. It's a lot of pressure. So that's the importance of doing our work. However, we're guided to do our work, whether it's breath work, which again is I think is the quickest, most efficient way that I know to clear our past wounds, um, or whether it's therapy or whether it's coaching, uh, we got to do our work, right? We got to go within and we got to face ourselves and ask ourselves the questions: why do I do the things I do? And again, that begins with self awareness. We can't do anything about what we can't see, what we're not aware of.
100%. So Christian de la Huerta doesn't just talk about conscious love, he embodies it. Today's conversation was a soulful roadmap to reclaiming power, presence, and the kind of love that evolves us. If you are ready to breathe deeper, love cleaner, and lead with soul, this is your invitation. Go forth and awaken the inner light of yours.